You're listening to the Poetry Cove Radio, the world's leading poetry radio station.
Hello and welcome to the first ever interview on the Poetry Cove Radio. I'm your host Sophie, and I'm joined today by our very first guest, Adam Gary. Adam is a poet and founder of the Poetry Cove. He has recently come out with a brand new poetry collection titled The Early Hours, as well as an accompanying album of poetry of the same title. Today we're going to take a look inside the mind of this poet and listen to a few tracks. Welcome, Adam. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Today is a huge day, obviously. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. The Early Hours is out today. We get to launch the radio show, well, the radio in general, finally. And we're doing a podcast too. So it's a good day. It's been a stressful time. I just had a puppy. I didn't have a puppy, I got a puppy. I just released a book. Yeah, it's been a stressful time, but it's here, so I'm really pleased to be here.
Would you tell us a little more about yourself and this upcoming collection of your work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a poet, obviously. I started out in acting. That was the first sort of dream, I guess. That was the original, the OG dream. I discovered acting when I was 6 in primary school, and I really wanted to do that, so I pursued that. Unfortunately, a few years ago, maybe even 4 years ago now, I kind of developed imposter syndrome and severe anxiety, so I stopped doing acting, and now I kind of do writing and poetry. I haven't really looked back since, and I do YouTube videos, how-to YouTube videos and stuff. And I've just launched the Poetry Cove, which you guys know about because you're here and listening, and here we are. Yeah, so I'm kind of just doing my own thing, an independent poet just doing his thing, I guess.
I love that.
Thank you.
So, this collection of poetry spans an entire decade and follows your 20s. This passage of time and your evolution as a poet is intentionally highlighted to be part of the narrative itself. Even the name, The Early Hours, is a reference to the beginning years of your career as a writer, and this book is made to showcase your progression as a poet over time. I'd like to take a moment now to play the titular poem, The Early Hours.
Let not the leaves of first summer fall in vain. Let not the bud's beauty wilt before its blooming spectacle. Let not blue skies juvenile cloud over before an August rain, nor burn too soon the work of lame Hephaestus. Unexceptional anviled chassis, the basis of Apollo's pruning. Chiron on the winding road leading through the gated abbey. And now the winter turns to spring, seeds become our stalks. Dion sleeps on a bed of stone, draped in petals freshly plucked. Noon has risen to shine her beauty and bid adieu to the morning dew. Her loving rays give birth and warms away the fresh and welcoming of these early hours.
Now, a person's 20s are a very formative time in someone's life, and most people leave them a completely different version of themselves than they came in with, or at least I'd hope so. As you were putting this collection together, what was it like going back and rereading earlier work that you've forgotten about?
It was difficult. I'm not going to lie to you, it was difficult. This whole book is supposed to be a celebration of the journey we go on as poets. I'm completely self-taught. When I first started out, I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that I wanted to express, and I know that there's a lot of poets out there that's like that. And of course, now I do YouTube and I review a lot of collections, and whether that's traditionally published collections or self-published collections, and so basically I'm a lot better read than I was back then, and I've learnt a lot more than I had back then. But as I say, I've read some collections and thought, wow, that's really not great. And I've read some other self-published collections and thought, wow, I really need to up my game. And so that's kind of what the early hours is about. It's about realizing my journey as a poet, looking back at who I was then and the style of poet I was then and who I am now, having come on this journey. But the main message of this is to not be embarrassed about having had to start from somewhere. Everyone's got to start from somewhere. Everyone's got to be a beginner. This is about embracing that and celebrating that. And it was difficult to do that whilst reading back some of the older stuff, because it was quite embarrassing, and it needed some reworking, and it was difficult. It was difficult to keep the motivation up, because when I was reading certain pieces, I just thought, oh man, it's just not great at all. But thankfully I stuck to it, and I remembered the whole message behind this book, and I kept going. And I'm just, yeah, it was difficult at times, but I'm glad I kept going, because I'm proud of what the early hours has become. And now I have this collection where I can, in 10 years time or whatever, I can again look back and think, oh man, this was the early works. The early hours actually started out titled as the early works, until you turned around and said, oh, that's not a good title. Or I can't remember what you said, but your point was valid, so I changed it to the early hours. Actually, I think you changed it to the early hours.
Yeah,
you
I
suggested
did.
the early hours, so thank you for that, because I love the title now.
Thank you. And I think a lot of poets have a sort of kill your darlings attitude to their earlier work, so I really admire how you're not afraid to show it, even though it may be difficult or, like you've said, embarrassing at times.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was definitely moments when I did feel like kill your darlings. I did think, oh, do you know what, I'm just going to let this die. But no, I'm glad I stuck to it, because I think it's an important message to send out to newer poets. Don't be embarrassed of where you've come from, I guess.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And before we move on to the next question, I just want to play another one of your poems, and this one is titled As I Lay Here.
Sure.
As I lay here with discontented heart and restless mind once more, in the early hours morn, belonging to the poets and painters, philosophers and deep thinkers, the lovers and the loners, my soul cries out for beauty, be it from within me, or out amongst the glimmering stars beyond my window. I think quietly of my life's problems, mistakes and missions, my life's loves and its undeniable hates. All I want to do now is right. My body must rest, but my brain fights. 'Tis now the creative hour, the time our souls leap out from their cages of fleshy carcass and sweep up gloriously into the night sky, fondly frolicking with one another, creating starry joyful madness, never to be witnessed by the sleeping mortal. Oh, the elation of such feisty supernatural festivities, swirling and swirling, refusing to leave the spectral world to conjoin with the flesh and bones of their mortal master. But all too soon sunrise doth come, and whilst the artists finally start drifting off into deep sleep, unwittingly enjoying their genius's good time, the regular world must shift back into consciousness to keep the world spinning in its regular routine.
So a quality that is endearing to me as a consumer of the early hours, yet equally frustrating as its author's girlfriend, is the self-deprecation and self-loathing that is featured throughout the work and social media marketing for this collection. Unlike many modern poets who sing their own praises in hopes of getting readers, you're very honest about your struggles with self-doubt and feelings of not being good enough. and you managed to sell your book by not really selling your book. There is, however, something vintage about this mindset, with many famous poets of the past being notoriously self-hating, like Charles Bukowski, for instance, who I know you draw inspiration from. Many view this attitude as a hallmark of an artist. Can you tell us more about your struggle with this, and would you advise other poets to be vintage in this regard, so to speak, or to not follow in your footsteps and be their own biggest fans?
I think that's a great question. I don't know if being vintage is the right phrase. I think the thing about being an artist, unfortunately, it's just the way it is. The thing about being an artist, it's ingrained in our DNA to hate ourselves, basically, unfortunately. I don't know an artist that doesn't hate themselves, unless they're going through a particularly good point in their career. The thing about artists, we have very different wiring in our brains, and that's scientifically proven. We understand the world differently. We don't understand the world through facts, and I'm not saying we don't believe facts, of course we do, but our very core way of understanding the world is through our emotions, through asking questions, and that's why it's very easy for us to hate ourselves and kind of say bad things and put ourselves down. And when people say, "Oh, I love this poem," you're like, "Yeah, thanks," but it's not. It's in our DNA. I think, speaking as someone who's completely independent and is completely building, whatever I'm building, career, if you want to call it a career, I don't know, but whatever I'm building, I'm doing it completely independently, right? And I advocate for that a lot, because I can't stand emailing publishers. I can't stand emailing agents and asking to be accepted and groveling and please love me, please love me. It's one of the things I hated about acting. So I'm more than happy to be on this path and on this journey and building what I'm building alone. If someone comes along like an agent, I'm not saying I'll never get an agent, I just won't actively seek one. I'm totally going on a tangent here. What I'm trying to say is we're going to be self-deprecating as artists. It's in our DNA. However, you're asking it, would I recommend them being their biggest fans? I think to some degree, this is what I was trying to get to, doing what I'm doing, you have to have a certain amount of self-confidence and a certain amount of belief and stiff upper lip and going for it. You have to, otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. But no, I wouldn't recommend someone go and get a big ego and think they're amazing and be their biggest fan. But also I think I would recommend people sitting down and looking up the science behind creatives and just knowing why we can be self-deprecating. I think that's really important because it makes things easier to deal with. I'm not necessarily saying that you should be on Bukowski's level, but just understanding how we work as artists. And yes, I would also say be a fan of yourself, not the biggest fan, but be a fan of yourself too. So a middle ground, I guess. It's probably a lot longer.
So hate yourself, but only a little bit.
Yeah, hate yourself, but just a tiny bit. And love yourself, but just a tiny bit.
Yeah, everything in moderation, except for
exactly.
moderation.
Balance, yin and yang, yin and yang.
So, for a long time, your magnum opus piece was Poet in the Long Dark Coat. When people heard your name, Adam Gary, they would hear that poem in their minds. Let me just take a moment and play that poem for the audience.
Sure, thank you.
Raindrops were dripping, the clouds swept high. He stormed out the door. If he stayed, he would die. Through soggy marsh fields of damp and green, he popped his collar, not wanting to be seen. Not a word of goodbye, not even a note. So walked the poet in the long dark coat. Nobody had seen him lurking around, not even a glimpse. He didn't want to be found. He was lost in his thoughts as he looked to the sky, and he wondered if the world was even alive. Painting pictures with words of his own, rambled on, did the poet in the long dark coat. He roamed as he pleased, from town over town, harmonica on mouth playing a sweet, sorrowed sound, for he'd seen that the world was all bark and no bite. And then from afar did he meet her sparkled eye as she stood in white, having read the words he'd wrote. She gave her heart to the poet in the long dark coat. But it wasn't enough to get him to stay, so she wailed at him and he went on his way. And was this all that the world would be so willing to show as they called for the poet in the long dark coat? And he answered their call without even a thought, for they'd taken the beauty he had so eagerly sought. They'd already shown him that they just didn't care. It was all over now. He just wasn't there. And he raised his gun with a single stroke. So flew did the poet in the long dark coat.
So for a while, this was the poem that you were the most well known for, but I think that's slowly being taken over by your titular piece, The Early Hours, which marks a transition to a seemingly more mature and evolved Adam Gary. Can you tell us what will happen to the poet in the long dark coat, and who comes after him? How have you evolved not only as a poet, but as a person?
Well, thank you for that very kind statement. I'm not sure that people would hear my name and think of poet in the long dark coat, but that's very kind.
I think so.
Oh, well, thank you very much. What was your question? Sorry, can you tell us what will happen to the poet in the long dark coat and who comes
Yeah,
after
what will happen to the poet in the long dark coat and who comes after him?
So, Poet in the Long Dark Coat is obviously very, very heavily influenced by Bob Dylan's song Man in the Long Black Coat. And that came about because I had a friend in college, Charles, and I don't think he'll mind me saying this. We weren't the most suave of people. We weren't the coolest kids in town. But we did like art. You know, a lot of people in college, for those who are in different countries, college in the UK, you're between 16 and 18. So it's 2 years. From 16 to 17 is the first year, 17 to 18 is the second year. A lot of people take performing arts courses because they're a DOS, you know, and they don't take it seriously. It's just a qualification to have, right? But there are a handful of people on that course that do want to take it seriously. Anyway, me and Charles was one of them, and we were loners, and we just loved this image of the wandering lone wolf artist dressed in black, and of course the song by Bob Dylan, Man in the Long Black Coat, sort of epitomizes that. And it's kind of my fantasy, and writing Poet in the Long Dark Coat was my way of living out that fantasy without actually having to ramble all over the country. And that's very much embedded in me still. Like, maybe my style has matured, but that fantasy is still very much in me. You know, I'd love to have a camper and stuff, and I normally dress in black. In fact, I'm wearing a very, very dark green jumper, which, you know, I don't often push the boat out further than that, to be honest with you. So nothing will happen to him. He's still... Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say that I've always really liked that lone wolf archetype, and I've always sort of been drawn to people like that, I guess, as an introvert myself, so I think it's really cool how you featured that in your work.
Well, thank you very much. I guess that's why you're drawn to me. So that still lives in me. That probably will always live in me. I love that sort of image. So I will always be the poet in the long dark coat, I guess. I need to buy a new long dark coat, actually, because mine's getting a bit old now. Who comes after him is still me, just with a different style, and hopefully a more mature style, and something that's a bit more traditional but also relatable. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I really want to make my poetry. I really see my poetry in the future being something that is something you can read and find in a traditionally published poetry collection by, I'm not saying I'm great, but by certain names, but also that can be related, can be relatable to John Smith off the street. I think it's important to kind of keep your poetry accessible to the masses, whilst also somehow putting in some craft and some tradition in there too. And I hope that I can weave a perfect balance for that.
Yeah, and speaking of tradition and relatability and trying to find that right balance, I want to play one of your poems called A Poet's Role.
Sure. Thank you.
The poet's role is not to rhyme. 'Tis not to enjambe or write lyrically, not to capitalize, grammarize, or even spell correctly. The poet's role is to capture humanity's soul. History passed by in a blink, but forever held in the poet's ink. To rouse and to soothe, romanticize and fantasize, to love and smile and frown and curse and hate. They may use tools and train to heighten the words they spake, but that is not the poet's role. Do not get carried away, but carry away.
I thought this poem was interesting because there seems to be an ongoing debate in the poetry world between technique versus emotion. What I find sort of ironic about this poem is that while it is taking the side of emotion, this is your most technically advanced collection of poetry, and you seem to employ many more classic poetic techniques as you grow as a poet. What do you think of this?
Yeah, so sorry, I think I may have answered this question prematurely, but yeah, look, in terms of technique versus emotion, I'll always choose emotion. I think you can know all the techniques in the world, but if there's no soul behind it, no heart, then I'm not interested. I think I will always choose emotion first. However, as I've just said, as I'm kind of transitioning into this new sort of style that I'm trying out, I am still very hot on technique, and I always promote technique in my YouTube videos. So I will always choose emotion first, but I think there should be, it's a very dull interview, I guess, but balance, I think it's important to have a balance. And hopefully that I can find that balance, and as I say, be something that is readable for people who are used to reading more advanced poetry. Again, I'm not saying my stuff is advanced, that's not for me to decide, but that's certainly what I'm aiming to do. I want people who are used to reading more advanced poetry to open my collection and enjoy it, whilst, Joe Smith off the street, whoever, who may never even picked up a poetry book, but may walk into a bookshop, see the early hours there, open it up, and be able to access all these emotions that I'm kind of trying to put on the page. And again, just balance, I guess. I think it's important going forward. I don't want to, basically what I'm saying is, I know I'm kind of, this book is sort of a goodbye to the old Adam, but I don't want to lose all of that guy. I kind of like how accessible my poetry was then, and I'm not looking to get rid of that. I'm looking to keep the sort of, not Instagram poetry, but how accessible Instagram poetry is. Everyone loves it because it's so accessible. I want to retain that, whilst also bringing the craft and technique and putting it on top.
And not only is this collection the most insightful in terms of your poetic range, but it is also your most personal collection and touches on certain family relationships that may have been hard to write about. For example, let's take a look at the Ungiving Tree.
A bird on each branch, eggs dropped, broken nests. Your arms aren't made for homes, just plenty of thin leaves, just plenty of leaves. Oak tree replaced by birch. We were supposed to be two, but a pairing cut down too soon fuel a fire. We weren't ever meant to be close to one another. Winter. Barren branches can't provide shade. Trees stand tall, don't they? Unmoving and stubborn. But summer will come again. The roots will keep me going. I won't die. I'll keep growing, as tall as you, and maybe farther.
What was it like being this vulnerable and writing that poem?
Honestly, I'm honestly sitting here being honest. To be honest with you, I never, ever write poetry. I never put books together. I never consider the after taste. I don't know. The after. Help me out here. What's the word I'm looking for? The aftermath, I guess.
Smoky afterbirth.
The afterbirth. Yeah.
Some of your listeners may get that reference, but you won't.
Oh no. Is it a Lana Del Rey reference?
No. It's from The Office.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the aftermath. I never consider that. I never kind of think, oh wow, this person's going to get a very sort of deep insight into my life. It's not something that kind of is part of my process. I just write, and if I like the poem, it gets sent out. And if people like it, great. If people don't like it, whatever, man.
Yeah, I like it. You don't give a fuck about what anyone
Pretty
thinks.
much, basically, yeah. It's just not something that is part of my thought process, I'm afraid. Sorry to be a bit of a boring answer.
Well, speaking of these more personal poems, as a writer, I know that there are often secret messages in my work that might be too obscure or too personal to be apparent to the reader, and I think that's okay. I think that it's a reminder that at the end of the day, you're writing for you and not the people behind the fourth wall. Some things are better left a mystery, and in the spirit of mystery, would you mind sharing one of these little personal bits from the collection?
Sure. I mean, I have to be honest with you. I'm talking to the Queen of Mystery right now. Like, all your poems are just fantastic extended metaphors, and they're really great. I have to be honest with you. It's not really my style. I did do an academy, a Poetry Cove Academy one-to-one tutoring with yourself, because I was reading all your poems and I thought, man, this is really great. I want to kind of learn how to do that. And funnily enough, the Ungiving Tree that we've just listened to came from your process that you taught me. So thank you so much for that. But writing in very writing in with hidden messages isn't really my style. I do like to kind of be all out there, and so people know exactly what I'm saying. However, I do leave there are hidden messages, especially acrostics. There's a handful of very obvious acrostics in this book, which is just the first letter of each line going down will spell out something. But that's not normally how I write acrostics. When I want to write an acrostic, I usually try to make it so hidden that even I've forgotten where they are. There may even be more acrostics in this book than even I know about, because I've obviously collected past poems. I'm talking about things like with the first letter of the first line will be the first letter, but then going down it'll be the first letter of the second word in the second line, then the first letter of the third word in the third line, and it kind of very, very hidden. But I also do like other hidden techniques that most poets do. You know, it's nothing special, nothing that I do special, but things like, for example, Scarlet 2, I think it is. I think it's Scarlet 2 or Scarlet 1. I think it's Scarlet 2, where I talk about the pansies reaching for Ether's eye, which is obviously a plant reaching out for the sun. I very very purposefully made that the longest line in the poem, like it's reaching out. At the end of that poem, it's like a half-finished sentence, and that's my sort of way of saying, you know, that's how I felt our relationship was at the very start of it. If you remember, when we were so like desperate to kind of talk to each other. I'm not saying we're not desperate to talk to each other now, but when it was all new and fresh, and we were so like longing for each other, and that's how I wanted to capture that feeling. But I wouldn't say that's a hidden message, but there are little things definitely to look out for. There is, I'm not going to say which poem it is or which page, but there is a poem that I put on a very specific page number. I'm not going to say which one it is, but there are little things that I do that, you know, could be missed very easily unless you want to look out for it. But yeah, sorry.
Well, I'm definitely going to look out for those acrostics.
Yeah, I hope they don't get me in trouble. I can be rude sometimes when I think no one's going to find them.
Well, thank you so much for that interview. And before we go, I just wanted to play one more of your poems that I found particularly humorous. And this one is called "A Seagull Stole My Life."
Thank you.
A seagull stole my life. Soaring high with wings wide, a fucking seagull stole my life. Sitting hunched over, back broken from shingle shoveling concrete, mixing aches and pains. Rain. Destined writer, explorer turned bruise bather. But at least I have jazz. Sweat on brow, hammer hits slab. Tramontane. Living between treadmill pillars. Up and down and soaring wild, free from strain, this seagull acts as a prince of skies, living life and stares at me, razzmatazz, roaming to and fro, killing me with its smug laugh-like gulling. Soaring high with wings wide, a seagull stole my life.
Thank you so much. That was Adam Gary, everyone, talking about his upcoming collection of poetry called The Early Hours, which is available for pre-order now.
Actually, it's available to order now. It's release day.
Yes, available to order now. We're filming this in advance.
Yes. Also, the album as well, my first poetry album is out now today as well, which you've been listening to throughout this interview. Thank you so much for interviewing me, and thank you so much for being part of this big occasion and launching the radio show. I really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for offering me this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, au revoir. I'm going to go and have a drink because it's launch day, even though you've told them we're recording it in advance, but it's all good. I'm gonna go and put my puppy to sleep. Actually, that's what I'm gonna do.
Good luck with
Thank
that.
you.
You're listening to the Poetry Cove Radio, the world's leading poetry radio station.